Joining me now is former Navy commander and Pentagon spokesperson J.D. Gordon. J.D., good to see you.
Liz, great to see you again.
All right, J.D., let's start out here with the question of the day before we even get into the details about Moldova. The question of the day is there an area in the world where corruption and chaos hasn't been worsened because of President Obama's disasters, his foreign policy?
Liz, I think it's worse around the entire world. And, you know, I went to 12 European countries in the last couple of years, including seven former Soviet republics. And I tell you, it's worse all around the world just because of President Obama's weak leadership.
Right, and I think that's especially true, like I was saying in the introduction, in Eastern Europe. We see what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Yugoslavia, and then in Moldova. That's not a country a lot of people are familiar with just off the top of their heads, but the corruption there, it really is like a James Bond plot. This $1 billion bank heist, that's an eighth of their GDP, an eighth. Even comparing that to what it would mean in the United States, it's outrageous.
It is outrageous. And first, you know, Moldova has a special place in my heart because it's distant geographically, but my father's father was born there when it was called Bessarabia and part of the Russian Empire. So it's always held a special place in my heart. This story came to my attention recently. You know, a couple years ago, there was this case where $1 billion disappeared from the banks, from three major banks in Moldova. It was stolen by the country's leaders. And it came to my attention because one of the people that was central to this just met with Victoria Nuland, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now, Victoria Nuland knows this gentleman. He's one of the richest men in Moldova. His name is Vladimir Plahotniuc, and he basically was a central figure in it. And some of his partners are already in jail. One's the former prime minister, Vladimir Filat. He's in a Moldovan jail. And another guy, another very colorful character named Ilan Shor, who's only 29 years old. But believe it or not, this guy owns a professional soccer team in Moldova. He's married to a very popular Russian singer, a pop star. So this guy, both of them stole a lot of money. They're both in Moldovan jail. Another former parliamentarian named Wisław Platon is in a Ukrainian jail. So this cuts across borders. Moldova's wedged between Romania and Ukraine, so it's in a very sensitive part of the world right now. And I think that the U.S. needs to get more involved. The FBI ought to be visiting these guys in jail because there's more to this. This guy, Plahotniuc, he's one of the leaders of the country still. He's one of the leaders of the Democratic Party in Moldova. So our investigators really need to get to the bottom of this and hold people accountable because that $1 billion, Liz, it came from us. And the reason it came from us is because the IMF keeps bailing out Moldova because these guys stole $1 billion. $1 billion, the eighth of their economy, that would be like, Liz, trillions of dollars disappearing from U.S. banks overnight. Could you imagine that?
Right. Like I said, it's an eighth of their GDP. If you put that in perspective, if you do that same percentage for the United States, it would be absolutely outrageous. And that does bring me to my next question. That's about why America should care about this. But JD, I think that this guy that we're talking about, Plahotniuc, if that's how you pronounce his name, he actually has the perfect name, by the way, for a corrupt individual because it's impossible to pronounce. So it's impossible to remember his name. But he is not an elected official in Moldova. That's one of the interesting parts of this story. He's just a rich businessman. But he owns half the country, and that's how he's gained such control over it, because his influence within the government is based off of the fact that he owns, his wealth controls so much of their nation. But JD, I do think it is worth questioning, besides the American taxpayer here, that we're the ones on the hook for these bailouts of Moldova, so it's our money here that's going. Why should America care about this in the foreign policy sense?
Well, I think they should care about it because it makes us look ridiculous, and also that money came out of our own pockets. So I don't want to give the IMF money based on my hard-earned money in taxes because the U.S. is the largest grantor to the IMF. So we're the biggest economy. We give the most to the IMF, and the IMF squanders it on bailing out Moldova because their three biggest banks failed. Here's another piece, though. Vice President Biden, he just mentioned that Ukraine has to clean up corruption. Well, we got to hold him to it. President Poroshenko really needs to help get to the bottom of this. That one guy who was a former Moldovan parliamentarian I mentioned, Wisław Platon, he's in a Ukrainian jail right now. Moldova wants to extradite him so they could silence him. They could kill him, frankly. So I don't think we should allow that to happen. We ought to put some diplomatic pressure on Ukraine to not extradite this guy. We ought to have our FBI investigators and other investigators talk to him in Ukraine.
Right, and let me go back to something that you said earlier in the segment, just to tie this all together. Now that we're all familiar with who Plahotniuc is, this oligarch. You mentioned that President Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, she met with him 3 months ago, she met with this guy who allegedly was the mastermind behind this $1 billion bank skimming heist, an eighth of the GDP in Moldova. Why would Obama have one of his State Department officials meet with this man?
Well, Liz, that's an excellent question, and it gets to the heart of the Obama administration. They coddle oligarchs, they coddle strongmen, because they basically want to do whatever is the easiest road. So that's why it came to my attention. I really wasn't very familiar with Mr. Plahotniak until Victoria Nuland met with him. But when an assistant secretary of state meets with someone that's really evolved, apparently. There were some great reporting from the Heritage Foundation and the Lexing Institute about his involvement. So I think that once she met with him, then people in Washington really need to start paying attention. So I think that the Obama administration just can't tolerate these oligarchs and dictators. You know, it drives me crazy, Liv. They preach about rule of law, about freedom and democracy, yet the Obama administration policies basically have the opposite effect. They weaken all those virtues. So these guys just drive me nuts. They don't practice what they preach. It's like hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, but selectively. If they don't like somebody, oh, they go after them. But if it's somebody that, hey, we want to be nice to for whatever ideological reason,
right.
They don't do anything about it. It just drives me nuts.
Right. They pretend to be on their high horse to have this moral righteousness, but really their moral compass doesn't seem to point due north. And I think you make a really good point here that President Obama, his foreign policy overall, it ends up, I like your word, it coddles these corrupt individuals, or even worse than that, these nations that are communist nations or even terror-sponsoring nations. We see this not only with Moldova, we see this with Iran, how Obama's handling Iran. We see it with how he refuses to support Israel against the Palestinian Authority. We saw how he was interacting, we'll say, and that's a kind word for the word that I was thinking, with Cuba. And then in Moldova, we see this all around the world, so we can't help but notice the trend that Obama's foreign policy makes the world a more dangerous place. And JD, this was certainly an interesting story. Like I said, it sounds more like the plot of a James Bond movie, but it's happening here, and our president is allowing our money to be a part of this. That's all the time we have for today, but thanks so much for being here. It was great to talk to you again. All right, you guys, let us know what you think. Never forget, it's our voices that make a difference in our nation. Tweet me, Liz_Wheeler. Share your thoughts, and we'll be back in a minute.